This is one of the last books that I did. It's with Ray Hickey. It's called, the title is his, Don't Tell Me It Can't Be Done. And if you know Ray, it sounds a lot like Ray. Let me tell you a little about Ray if you don't know him. Ray is really a true Horatio Alger story. He is the youngest of 10 kids that grew up really dirt poor in first Montana, and then they moved to Idaho. He didn't finish high school. He said he had some kind of disagreement with the principal when he was in 11th grade and left for the Marines. He got in at the tail end of World War II and was sent to China to repatriate Japanese soldiers back to their homeland. Came back, wasn't really sure what to do. He had spent a number of years working ever since he was 16 in the ore mills there. Didn't really want to do that. His sister saw an advertisement in the Spokane paper that was asking for tugboat crew members. He had never seen a tugboat, he had never seen the Columbia River, but he thought, I'll sign up for it. So he sent in his application, he was accepted. He came and started in September of 1951 as a deckhand. That lasted 2 days. The chief engineer on board the boat walked off the boat, which didn't happen very often, and since Ray had some training in hydraulics and diesel engines, they said, guess what? You are the new chief engineer. So he had to learn on the job. Well, he worked his way from being a deckhand up to owning the company. He retired in 1996, sold the company for lots and lots of millions of dollars. He is now one of the biggest philanthropists in the area. He has all kinds of interests. He just endowed a chair at Dornbecker Children's Institute. Ray is just a very, very interesting guy. This book isn't really about what I'm talking about today. I'm excerpting some of the principles I'm going to talk from this book. He wanted to write this book especially to young people, because he thinks that folks of his generation have more or less written them off and think that maybe they're not worth talking to. Ray wants to say, I want to encourage you. If he calls himself a hay shaker. If a hay shaker from Idaho can do this, so can you. So that's what this book is about. Now, I spent a little over a year helping Ray to write the book. It was one of the more challenging things I'd ever done. Ray just turned 80. He has his offices he built a new office building right on the Columbia River on the Vancouver side of the river. I went up there. I've never been like this with an author where after writing every chapter, I actually had to go up there and read it to him, because Ray processes things orally, not written down. So it took a little longer, but I think it was worth it. I really liked this book, and that's where we're going to be taking a lot of the stories today. Ray was at Tidewater for 45 years. He was in management most of that time. Even when he was a chief engineer, he was still in management, even though it was just on the boat. He rose from deckhand to engineer to chief engineer to operations manager to general manager to president, and finally became president. Tidewater over those years had very little turnover. Very little turnover. Most of the people who were there stayed there for years and years, decades. And the question is why? That was one of the main things that made them highly profitable at the time Ray finally sold the company. How were they able to keep their employees for that long? And I'm convinced, after having spent that year with Ray, that a big part of it had to do with his management style, which I say had both a very clear hard side and a soft side. And it wasn't that he alternated between the two, and you never knew for sure which Ray Hickey you were going to see. People who watched Ray knew exactly what they were going to see depending on the circumstances. They knew if the hard was going to come or if the soft was going to come, and they depended on it. They knew that he wasn't going to fluctuate and become some raving madman. On the other hand, they knew that they could depend on him for certain things. That's one reason why he kept employees for so long. And what I'd like to do this morning is take a case study approach. Look at several pairs of both the hard side and the soft side, mostly by telling stories. Some of them I'll read, some of them I'll just tell, to show you how Ray managed to keep his people for as long as he did and make the company as successful as he finally did. The first one I want to look at, I would say, is generous, which is the soft side, yet demanding. Generous. Ray is a very generous guy, and everybody who knows him knows that. There was a time in the 80s when the company was going through some real problems. A lot of barge companies were going under at that point. Tidewater was one of the few that was staying afloat, but it was having difficulty too. And Ray finally came to the point where he realized he had to make some cuts. So he asked everybody in the company to take a 10% pay cut. Now, if he had been always harsh, you can pretty much guarantee that not all of them would have said yes, but all of them did. with the exception of one. They took that pay cut. Ray didn't give them any promises about what was going to happen. He didn't say, you know, once we turn it around, we're going to do this or that. He didn't make any of those promises. But about a year later, after the company had turned around, company employees opened up their checks, and each one of them had a check in there for the amount of what they had given up plus some. When he sold the company in 1996, he wanted to do something special for these people that he considered his family. And so for everybody in the company, regardless of what they did, whether they were janitors or a night watchman, there was one night watchman who had been there for 20 years. He gave everybody in the company $500 for every year of service. Everybody in the company. And he did that out of the money that he had gotten from the sale, not before the sale. People came to rely on Ray's generosity. He learned it, he says, from his dad. And there's an interesting story towards the end of the book. When they lived on the farm, his dad had a spirit of generosity, and he learned a lot from his dad. There were some neighbors that asked them to plow a field of theirs because they needed some work done and they didn't have a tractor. So Ray and his dad went over there and did that, and they got the job done. Ray went back to his farm to clean up the tractor, and his dad was gone for a while, and he came back, and Ray said, well, that worked out pretty well, didn't it? And he said, yeah, it did. And Ray said, and I knew the other shoe was about to drop. He said, what? He said, well, you know, they got 5 kids, and they're really struggling, and so she couldn't pay us right now. But she's going to pay us later. And Ray said, okay. A year later, he sees the lady drive up that had hired them, saw his dad go out to talk to her. He came back, and Ray said, how'd that go? And he said, really well. See, she paid us. And he showed him the money, and in Ray's terminology, it wasn't nearly what we had talked about. But he said, that worked out really well, didn't it? And he said, yeah, and she wants us to do it again this year. And they did. That's where he learned it. But he also had a demanding side. Let me read a little story. Ray, one of the loves of his life when he was younger, he was a coach in Little League. He didn't want to be the coach, he didn't want to be the manager, but nobody else would do it. And so he writes, I knew my duties at Tidewater would often take me out to sea, so when I agreed to manage the baseball team, I grabbed the list of my players and their home phone numbers and called all of their parents. I asked them to come to my house for a meeting which began like this, and this really sounds like Ray. The reason I'm the coach is because nobody else in this room would take the job. How's that for starting out? I don't consider myself qualified for it, but I would like to have it understood that I'll do the very best I can. And when anybody feels qualified to criticize, then they should also be ready to take over. He said, I didn't want some parent who refused the job telling me how to do it right. The speech must have worked because I never had any problems with the parents. Everybody knew that when he said something like that, he meant it. And if he had gotten that criticism, I can guarantee you that Ray Hickey would have left. He made it very clear. He also gave a speech to every employee that came to him that they hired. He called it his stool pigeon speech. He would bring them into his office and he would say, now I'd like to have it understood that here at Tidewater we do not abide backbiting or what he called stool pigeons or coming in the back door. He said, you need to know that if you come in here to complain about somebody in the company, the next person you're going to see is the person you're complaining about. And he enforced it. People understood both of those sides of him. They came to rely on it. He was also protective on the one hand, but he could also be confrontational on the other hand. Protective. One of my favorite stories in the book is one that he told, one of the last things that went into the book. When he was owner of Tidewater, they were thinking about getting into the wood chips business, but they didn't have any way of moving them around, so they're going to have to build some new barges just for the wood chips business. They also needed some equipment to help them make all of this process go better. And so they had heard that there was some equipment, exactly the kind of stuff that they needed up in Vancouver, British Columbia. So they flew up there, but as soon as they got there, they realized that the price was going to be way over what they were willing to pay. And so all of his guys, there's about 5 of them altogether, were ready to just get in the plane and go back home. And Ray just kept wandering around. It was a bid throughout the day of all of this equipment. And they kept saying, Ray, what are you doing? We need to go. And he wouldn't answer them. He would just walk around. And finally, it came to the key piece of equipment that you needed to make this whole operation work. Nobody had been bidding against this group of investors that was sitting at this table, looking very proud and very efficient, until it came to the key piece of equipment. And then all of a sudden, somebody kept bidding the price up. And it went from $200,000 to $300,000 to $500,000 to $750,000. And finally, the group called a timeout, which you never did in those kinds of bidding wars. And they're looking around and they're wondering, who's doing this? Who's doing this? And Ray's guys are saying, who's bidding? Who's bidding? And they look at Ray and he's got a smile on his face. And now they knew who was doing the bidding. One of them goes over and says, are you crazy? You don't even have enough money to buy a sandwich. What are you doing, bidding on this? And he said, just leave me alone. So they left him alone. Finally, the price got up to over $1 million, and Ray let him have it. Afterwards, they came up and they said, what were you thinking? He said, well, I was talking with the owners of this equipment beforehand, and they told me what these guys had already done to them, that they were trying to bid on everything on just pennies for the dollar, and it was going to ruin them. And so I decided to help them. That was Ray. Remember when I told you before that he had gone to everybody in the company asking for that 10% pay cut? He actually personally went to every single one of them. His financial guy, Clarence Slingstead, asked him not to do it. He said, Ray, we have other people in the company to do that. You don't need to do that. And Ray said, no, I need to do this. And so he went to every single person in the company. And at that point, I think it was around 200, 220 employees. After they turned the company around, Clarence came into his room afterwards. He said, Ray, I need to talk to you. And he said, okay, talk. And he said, before when I really opposed you going to everybody in the company and doing it personally, he said, yeah. He said, you were right. If you had not done that, I think we would have gone under. Ray was willing to do that kind of thing, and everybody knew that he was protective of them. He felt like the people in Tidewater were his family. But, on the other hand, he could be very confrontational with those same people. One of the stories, he was unsure if he wanted to put a couple of these stories in because he thought it painted him in too harsh of a light. But I thought they were great stories because they show exactly what a leader like him had to do in order to keep that company moving forward. One of them happened with his captains. The guy who used to run the company before he did had kind of let things slide. And he had let a lot of regulations that were supposed to be enforced not be enforced. And one of them was, insurance people said that you are not allowed to have non-staff personnel on the tugs. Well, the captains of the tugs and the pilots of the tugs had kind of an unwritten rule that they could bring their wives on board for their trips. None of the crewmen could, nobody else could, but just the captains and the pilots. Ray asked about that. He said, can anybody else? They said, no. He said, all right, I hate to do this, but from now on, there are no wives allowed on the boats. Well, that, of course, infuriated the captains. There was one captain and his wife who came over to Ray's house on a Sunday afternoon, and Ray said, before you come in here, I don't want to talk business. And the captain's wife just lit into him. She said, I'll have you know that I know the owner, and I'm going to go to the owner. And Ray said, good, talk to Lou, talk to God, but you're not getting on the tugs. Another captain was furious and said, my wife works. And so one of the only times I get to spend on her is when she's in town and we can go on the tugs. And Ray said, I'm sorry, insurance won't allow us to do it. And the captain said, well, then one thing we know for sure, that you're going to fire me tomorrow. And Ray said, why is that? He said, because I get on the boat tomorrow and so is my wife. And Ray said, okay, well, one thing we do know for sure, your wife is going to get on the boat and tomorrow you are going to get fired. And the next day came and the wife did not get on the boat. And that guy, the captain and Ray, became best of friends and still are good friends. And part of it was because of that hard side. They knew that when he said something, he meant it. There's another story that's also one of my favorite, and this is one in particular that Ray wasn't sure he wanted in here because he thought it made him look too harsh, but I think it really illustrates the point. He says, one time a captain returned to his boat intoxicated, which is a huge no-no. Before he could get back on the boat, somebody called to let me know what had happened, and others took care of the situation on the site. Immediately upon his return home, he got summoned to see me. He'd been a good captain with 19 years of faithful service, but he drank too much. When he showed up at my office, I told him, Captain, you have a problem, and we are going to get it corrected. We're going to have a discussion right now, and you are going to make a decision, and then we're going to go from there. He nodded his head but said little, so I continued. I've heard it's about how you spend your time off the boat. We're not going to talk today about coming to the boat intoxicated. What we're going to talk about today is whether you want to keep working here. And if you want to keep working here, then you're not going to take another drink. Not on the boat or off the boat or anyplace else. Your drinking days are over, because every time you get started on your time off, I hear the stories. So I have a proposition for you. What is it? The guy asked quietly. If you want to keep working for Tidewater, then you're not going to drink anymore. You can be second in charge on the boat, but you've already proven that you can't have the responsibility of the top spot. So you'll never be the captain again, but you can be a pilot if you want the job. Now, the job of pilot is almost the same as that of captain, except that he's not in charge of the boat. After we discussed my offer, he accepted it, and then we took him to a treatment center. From then on, you never could have found a better person. He stopped drinking and enjoyed his new job. I'd check on him every so often, and his co-workers told me that after a crew change, when they might be driving home and want to stop for a beer, my friend would have a Coke, but never once mentioned wanting to have a beer. Now, here's the interesting part of the story to me. He says, does this sound a little rough? And it does. He even said, I don't even know if you could do that legally today, but in those days you could. He said, I don't think it is, and I know that it sometimes works. It takes different things for different teammates. I know it worked for him. After he retired, he said to me, Chief, that's what everybody called him, the chief, I wish you had done that to me when I was 20 years old. And Ray says, I wish I had too. It would have meant having a productive, happy teammate for a lot more years. He was protective of his people, and yet he could also be confrontational. Humor is also a big deal to Ray. Now, if you've been around him for a while, he is basically an old salt. You can tell that the guy spent a lot of years on the ocean because that persona is still with him. But he loved humor, and that's one of the things that kept them going, especially on the boats and sometimes in the office. For example, when he was a chief engineer on one of the tugs, his captain decided he was going to play a joke on him. And in those days, they had speaking tubes. They weren't electronic. They were speaking tubes that went from the pilot house down to the galley, where Ray happened to be at that time. Most of the boats in the early days of Tidewater were refurbished World War II vessels. That's how they kind of built the company until they could build new stuff. And this was one of those. And the captain called down to the galley and said, is Ray there? And they said, yeah. He said, put him on. So Ray puts his ear up to the speaking tube, and the captain pours water down it. And so he gets an earful of water. And that's one thing that you had to be very careful about doing with Ray Hickey, because if you did that, you knew something was going to come later on. The captain didn't think about that. So what Ray decided to do is a little later, not on that same trip, probably a couple trips later, he waited until the captain was out of the pilot house, and then he went up to the same speaking tube and he dumped a bunch of pepper in it. And then he went down to the galley, waited till the captain was back, asked for the captain got on board, and he took a pressurized hose and sprayed it up there, and the guy got pepper all over his face. That's the kind of stuff they were continually doing on board the ship. One of my favorite stories doesn't have a lot to do with Ray, but he tells it all the time, so it does have a lot to do with him. This is the kind of atmosphere he tried to create. On one of their boats, the galley was here, and right outside the door to the galley there was a room that had two very loud generators. You always wanted to keep that door quiet, because when the generators were going, you could hardly hear anything else. Well, one day there was the two deckhands on boat were coming through, and these guys did most things together, and one guy came in the galley and he thought the other guy was right behind him, but he went somewhere else. And so he left the door open. And on this boat, there was an engineer who was really, Ray calls him a crab. He was a crank. He was always angry about something. And he was sitting at the table having his morning coffee. And this deckhand walks in and leaves the door open, and the generators are howling outside, and he shouts, "What's the matter with you? Were you born in a barn?" And without missing a step, the guy says, "Why, yes, I was. And in fact, I get homesick whenever I see a horse's rear end." And he continued to walk out. Ray said he laughed. He said, "What else can you do?" And the guy didn't know what to say. So he could be humorous. He likes to tell a lot of golf jokes. But Ray was also very serious, and you knew he wasn't all about just telling jokes. There was a young crewman one time who, when Ray at this time was either the general manager or the president, I don't remember which, who was having some trouble on his tug with the captain. And they weren't getting some things straightened out, and he didn't know what to do, and so he was talking to another captain about the situation, and the captain said, "Well, you need to go talk to Ray." And the guy said, No, I don't want to do that. He said, "Well, tell me about your problem." The guy told him. He said, "You have a problem. You need to get it solved." And he said, "Well, will going to Ray help?" And the guy said, "Well, I'll tell you one thing. If you go into Ray, you will get an answer. It may not be the one you want, but you'll get an answer." That was Ray's policy. People knew it. It was a very serious thing to go into his office. You didn't do it just on a lark. He was, once he was the owner of the company, he was on the board of American Waterways Operators, which kind of is an organization for all of tugboat companies and barge lines and stuff across the United States. And they used to have their meetings in Washington, D.C. And the first few years, they used to just drive Ray crazy, because the AWO had a great executive director who, in fact, had written some of the manuals for the Naval Academy, so the guy was very, very capable. But every time at their meetings, they'd spend the first day and a half going over the roster of the AWO and deciding whether this guy had made good decisions on who got raises and who didn't. And it drove Ray nuts. And finally, one day, he spoke up about it. And he went on and on about how it was stupid, and if you hire a good manager, you let him manage. You don't have to do this micromanaging stuff. And the president of the board said, well, tell us, Ray, what do you really think about it? And he said, that's the most stupid thing in the world. If it was at Tidewater, it wouldn't last for 15 seconds. And they said, well, thank you. Now we know what you really mean. And in fact, over the course of the next few weeks, they did change their procedures, and so then they spent only about half a day on the stuff that used to take them a day and a half. Ray could be very serious, and you knew exactly what he was talking about. On the one hand, he could be self-deprecating. And on the other hand, he demanded respect. He was both things. At the beginning of the book, I told you, he uses this phrase a couple times, and when you talk to him over a period of time, you'll probably hear him use it more than once. He says, listen, if a poor young hayshaker from Idaho can rise from deckhand to owner of the largest inland barge line west of the Mississippi without finishing high school, then there's no reason you can't apply the same principles that got him to that position to help you find your own success. That's Ray. He doesn't have any problem at all talking about the fact that he didn't finish high school, that he didn't get to go to college. Education was very important to him, and he made sure all of his kids went, but he never went there. He got his training at trade schools and in correspondence schools. But he's very self-deprecating. He tells jokes about himself and on himself all the time. He ends one chapter like this. I thought it was kind of funny. He says somebody once approached him and asked him, what does it take to work on to be a crew member on a tugboat? And Ray replied, a 54 shirt and a 4 hat. The guy asked him, did you qualify? He said, just for the hat. That's Ray. He talks about himself like that all the time, and yet he demanded respect. When he was the operations manager of the ocean-going side of Tidewater at that point, there was a young guy that had been on one of the crews. This was only his first or second trip, and they had just come into Longview, and they had to put a kind of an asphalt kind of thing over the top of the ship when it came in. It was a dirty, smelly job. And Ray went there to pick the guys up and to bring them back to Vancouver, and he had his brand new, his own personal, is it called Travelall? Is that what it called? It's a big, big car. And he went to go talk to the guys, and this young guy had already left, and he saw that Ray had come in this car, and he slid in this brand new car with this sticky tar stuff all over him and spread it all over the seat. Ray came back and sees this young guy in his car, and he says, what are you doing? The guy says, what do you mean? He says, you just spread that stuff all over the back seat of my car. And he says, well, what do you care? It's a company car, isn't it? And Ray said, no, it's not a company car. And even if it were a company car, it wouldn't make any difference. And the guy says, well, I don't see why it should make any difference. And Ray said, well, long term it wasn't, but temporary it does because you're fired. And he said, nobody in the car that day felt any different than I did. Here's what he writes on page 165. This is real typical of Ray and his management style. He says, treating your coworkers with respect doesn't mean that you default on your own responsibilities. If you're in charge of a project or have some supervisory role over others, being an equal doesn't mean you tally up votes and do whatever the majority says. We've probably all known individuals who felt so concerned that someone might accuse them of a God complex that they lost control of their group or situation. Despite their supervisory duties, they tried to become everybody's buddy, and then none of their buddies would listen to them anymore. While I hope our people at Tidewater considered me their friend, they never forgot that I was the chief, and that's the truth. The buck stopped with me, and every once in a while I had to remind someone of the fact. Ray could be very encouraging, on the one hand, and yet on the other hand, he could be really correcting. There was a guy that came to them from the Coast Guard, and Ray gave a little speech one day on what he expected of them, and it kind of disturbed the guy. And the next day, Ray saw that it disturbed him. He said, you know, did my speech disturb you? He said, yeah. He said, can you tell me how you're going to meet my standards? And Ray said, no, I can't. He said, because I can't either, to tell you the truth. And he left. But the guy came to understand from that Ray, even though he set these high standards, he wasn't going to be an ogre about it either. He was somebody that you could approach. He was somebody that you could encourage, or that would encourage you, and that's what he did with this guy. When he was a coach of the Little League team, there was a young kid that wasn't even on his team. His name was Matt. Ray loves this story. I heard this several times. Where Ray was sitting in the dugout once with his own team, and young Matt came running to him across an adjacent field, and he said, Mr. Hickey, I don't know how to hit. And so Ray, even though the kid wasn't on his team, spent a good deal of time with him, telling him, you know, you just keep trying. You keep your eye on the ball. I mean, all the stuff that a coach is going to say. And he said, you just keep at it, and you tell me how things go. And a week or so later, a couple of weeks later, this kid comes running across the same field, all excited, Mr. Hickey, Mr. Hickey, and it's in the middle of a ball game. And Ray gets up and he walks over to the fence and says, what's happening, Matt? And he said, I got a hit! And Ray took him out after the game. He took him out and got him a snow cone. Again, even though this kid wasn't even on his team. Ray knew how to give encouragement to people, whether it's on his Little League teams or in his company, that really encouraged them to succeed. And people knew that they would get that from him. On the other hand, he didn't have any problem correcting people. At one point, they had signed a contract with a supplier to bring in a barge and to clean it up and to get it on time. And, well, things didn't go so well. The thing was late, and the supplier ended up having to spend a lot of money that they shouldn't have. Ray's dispatcher blamed it on the company that had hired some intermediaries. And as soon as Ray found out about that, he got on the phone and he called the dispatcher and he said, listen, that is our fault. It's our contract with them. I don't care whose fault it is. The guy said, no, but you don't understand. It wasn't our fault. Ray said, it doesn't make any difference. We're the company that signed the contract. We are the ones that are going to take responsibility. I don't want you to do that again. And the guy never did it again. There was a dispute one time on one of the tugs where between an elevator operator who could be kind of gruff and a tugboat member who could also be kind of gruff. And they got into such dispute that they almost got into a fight. Ray found out about it, called the dispatcher, the elevator operator, and the guy said, Ray, it isn't so serious that you need to get involved. And Ray said, well, yes it is. He's a member of the Tidewater team, and this is not going to happen again. He apologized. He called the captain, and he said, I need to see you. The captain came in, and he said, I understand that there's this altercation. The captain said, well, you need to understand there's two sides to the story. Ray said, I don't want to hear it. Your crew member is a member of Tidewater. He got into a fight with one of our customers. That will not happen again. Let me tell you what will happen. If it does happen again, I'm going to call you both. Well, no, I need to back up. He said, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. First of all, you're going to have a discussion with your crew member and make it clear to him that that never happens again. Second, if you don't have that discussion, I'm going to call you into my office and I'm going to fire both you and him. It didn't happen again. He knew how to be both encouraging and yet correcting. And as I was working on the book, this really didn't have anything to do with the book, but I tend to think biblically and theologically. Ray will tell you that he is not a particularly religious or church-going guy, so it certainly didn't come from him. But I thought, you know, it's interesting. I wonder if one of the reasons why Ray was so effective with his teammates is because his management style, and don't laugh, I'm serious about this, seems to reflect the management style, if you want to say that, of God as described in the Bible, who can be both serious, hard, and soft. Now, if I told Ray that he should write a book called God's Management Style, I think I would see his hard side, so we won't talk about that anymore. But it just occurred to me that that seems to be a theme throughout, and I couldn't help but wonder if that was one of the reasons that made him so effective. One last one. Ray could be very empowering, but he also expected a great deal. When he was working with his kids in Little League, they would come to him and ask him about batting. Do you know what he says is his best advice on batting? He would tell the kids to find their own strike zone. By that he meant this. He had noticed that when the kids were up to bat, their parents and the people in the stands would say, "That ball was out of the strike zone, don't swing," or whatever. And Ray said, "I don't care what you swing at. You find your own strike zone. The strikes and balls are for the umpires. They're not for you. You find your own strike zone." And he tells one story of one kid that he had told that, who had been struggling a little bit, swang at a ball that was almost in the dirt, and he knocked it out of the park. His teams, he took a team that was an expansion team, and in a couple years they won the title up in Vancouver for 2 or 3 years in a row. Part of it because of advice like that. He was deeply empowering to the people who worked for him or who played for him. He put things, if they had authority for it, he gave them the responsibility and the authority for it. On the other hand, he could also expect an awful lot. When he was a chief engineer on a tugboat one time, he had been on vacation and he came back, and on the engine, which he felt was his baby, there was a coffee can hanging from part of the engine that was catching some dripping oil. This was not something that Ray Hickey would like. He had a very brief confrontation with the engineer at the time, and he said, "I think that coffee can is still in orbit." So he whacked the thing. He didn't have any problem being empowering, but he also expected a great deal, and if you didn't live up to it, you found out about it. Let me end with just one letter. This was a guy by the name of Glenn, who was another one of Ray's. He was a 16-year-old kid at the time, and he asked Glenn if he would help him with Little League, because Glenn always was watching. Glenn didn't realize at the time that Ray was helping him more than he was helping Ray. Ray asked him if he wanted to help. He eventually wound up in the state police, I think he was in second command in the state police in Washington. He said, "Ray's Little League team practiced at a school very close to my home. Every time I saw his team out there, and I was always hanging out at the ball field, I went over to watch. I was a baseball junkie. Ray noticed my interest and one day asked me, 'Do you want to help?' I knew a little about Ray because my uncle worked for him, so I said, 'Sure.' Only years later did I realize that I was not helping Ray, he was helping me. Ray saw something in me, a naive and immature 16-year-old, that made him think this kid just needs a little guidance, a little direction, a little attention. After that, I practically lived at Ray's house. I joined his family on vacations and went camping with him. You know, Ray, I still kid him today, 39 years later, I'm still tagging along with you. In me, Ray saw an opportunity to guide and mentor an eager young kid. During my senior year in high school, he asked if I had lined up a summer job. Well, I said, I was going to work in the strawberry fields. I'll tell you what, he said, you come to Tidewater and I'll put you to work. He meant that. I came and he did, and it seemed like he had me doing every dirty, hard job there ever was. He explained that he wanted to teach me the value of hard work. He also told me, as long as you are going to school, you will have a job here at Tidewater. He paused, then added, you quit school and I'll fire you. Now, if you spend any time around Ray, you know when he's kidding and when he's not. And when he used that particular tone of voice, I knew he was not kidding. Tidewater found some type of work for me to do all through my college years, keeping me employed during holidays and on the weekends. In fact, Ray financed my way through college by allowing me to work flexible hours. Sometimes he'd say to me, we hired you to work 8 hours, but if you get your work done in 4 hours, then you might want to spend your time wisely, like studying. That's the type of mentoring and guidance that Ray gave to me, and I love him like a father. That little story to me encapsulates his management style. It was very encouraging, the soft side, but it could also be very hard. And that's why he kept people so long and why Tidewater became so successful under him. Any questions? Yeah, I asked him about that. The question was, did he talk about any negative examples about what he did that he shouldn't have done? He doesn't dwell on that kind of stuff. He will tell you stories. There are a few of them in here where he thinks he made maybe a strategic mistake, or he should have done this and he didn't do that. Sometimes he would get in confrontations, like he was in the mill at one point, and he asked his supervisor, he had an idea for a job, or a way they could do a job, and he asked the supervisor, is it okay if I tell you about it? And the supervisor said, sure, so Ray told him about it, and the more he talked about it, the redder and redder this guy's face got. And finally the guy blurted out, who the hell do you think you are? I've been doing this job for 20 years. I don't need some kid telling me how to do it. And Ray said, and is there anything else you want to apologize for? And he says, maybe that wasn't the smartest thing to say at the time. Any other questions? Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Steve.